Hi everybody, it's Susan again. This time we're going to have a look at Meghan Markle, or the Duchess of Sussex, and she's been married to Prince Harry. I already did Prince Harry's astrology. You'll find that in a separate video. There's also a part of that video which talks about his transit, especially with regards to releasing this book, which he's deeply going to regret, I think. One of the things that I wanted to understand was, why is Meghan so disliked, and what is it about her that puts people off? And I want to show you astrologically how that shows up. I want to also say that these are people, and one thing that has really struck me in the unfortunate research that I've had to do to get to understand this story a little bit better is that people are really mean, really cruel, extremely judgmental. And even though Meghan has an aspect of this in her own chart, which we'll see shortly, we want to also hold people in a certain space of tolerance and compassion. We're not living their life. We cannot know what it's like. As a consulting astrologer, I always look for the person's wound, if you like, what the trauma is that they're trying to overcome. It is in every one of us. It comes through generations as well. So we see that in the chart in different ways. And Meghan is no different. And so we can't look at this individual in isolation. We have to look at her as a continuum of things that have gone before, especially, of course, from her visible childhood, but including her family that she doesn't even maybe know, people from other generations. For example, the aspect of wanting to be famous. So there's other people in her family before her that wanted to be famous. And so there's a certain amount of insecurity, a certain amount of built-in rejection in her that is something she's come into. It's not just about Meghan. And then there's also an aspect of wanting to be seen, wanting to be visible. That's also something that stands out. And there's also an inherited aspect of dishonesty. And again, it's not just Meghan. It's coming through her experience of her parents and even other relatives in the distant past. And so there is a family pattern of certain things that we are all born into, and that really strongly influences our lives for good or bad. And from my point of view, when people come to me, it's usually because they're trying to resolve something, trying to understand something about themselves. So we don't really need to emphasize all the good bits, because the good bits take care of themselves. It's often where we can find the solution, which is very helpful, and every chart has good and bad in it. Every chart has the potential for something to go in either direction as well. Some charts have more potential in a particular direction, which we'll see shortly, and especially that depends on some major influences in the chart that really stand out. And some people's lives are much more visible than others, and so the pain that they're trying to work through and the things that they're trying to get over are much more public. Of course, that can be something that people are choosing to do, but we should still be compassionate because they're dealing with their private, even historical stuff, but they're doing that in a public forum, and so we want to hold that in our minds while we're looking at all of this. There are a number of things that I'm going to be quite direct about here that I would never say directly to a client. I would frame it slightly differently, and sometimes I'm going to just tell you both ways. I'm going to tell you how I see it, and I'm going to tell you how I would frame it, because I know some of you are astrologers as well. So we have to be quite careful when dealing with some aspects of personalities and some types of people. You want to be careful how you frame things, and that can also apply to transits that they might be experiencing. So let's just do a really quick run through of her chart, and then we're going to answer those questions. Why do so many people dislike her? And in particular, we're going to also look at the issue around lying or dishonesty or prevaricating, and also around manipulation and control issues. So we're going to have a bit of a tour of the basics, and then we're going to go into the deeper questions of the chart. To begin with, we see she has an ascendant in Cancer. So she is somebody who's genuinely emotionally sensitive. The tendency of this individual is to be quite caring, quite nurturing. And the ruler of this Cancer ascendant is in the 4th house, which is typically Cancer's home in the natural zodiac. And so we have Moon in Libra, which is a little bit more standoffish than Cancer. Moon in Libra has a little bit more challenge, understanding emotions, really experiencing or expressing emotions. And Meghan has this in a number of different ways, this challenge around emotions. One of which is that Saturn is directly on the moon to within a degree. That's very, very strong as a conjunction. And it suggests that there's a lot of emotional baggage that comes through the family. Relationships with the parents, both of them, were not easy. That we can see. There may have also been a sense, and I see this for a number of different reasons, that she may not have been wanted. And again, that doesn't mean that she, Meghan, was not wanted. It is that a baby came at a time that was really inconvenient, or the person who became pregnant, or the couple, mother or father, was not ready, not willing to accept this particular situation. And so it's not a personal thing, it's a situational thing, and that energy is very much in the birth chart. What that does already is it sets up a person for feeling like they don't belong, the feeling really like they are the outsider or the one who's kind of not welcome. The other aspect that we can see this in is that Chiron in the 11th house, which is sextiling the ascendant, showing that there's a wounding around who she feels herself to be. Her very sense of self. This sextile is, although it's favorable, it's Chiron, and that makes it something of a emotional wound. That is reinforcing what I just said about this sense of, do I belong? Am I welcome here? Do I get to show up? Why can't I fit in? This is a really big theme in her chart right off the bat. So we can already feel for this individual who's come into this world with a sense that she doesn't have her place, that she doesn't belong. And yet one of the things that stands out very, very strongly with all this Leo energy is that she wants nothing more than to be seen, than to be praised, than to be adored. We'll have a look at that because it's a bit of an Achilles heel for her as well. The other aspect of this Cancer ascendant is that it is in a square, relatively close square with Pluto, which is 2 degrees off. That's heavy, that's hard. When the ascendant is squaring, that also means that the descendant is squaring. So that's a T-square between Pluto and the ascendant-descendant axis. And so we're seeing that that complicates a lot around relationships. It complicates a lot around a person's sense of how they should behave, how they should act in the world. And it really magnifies this desire to be seen, to take control as well, to feel in control, and to feel quite almost defensive about themselves, and that including, in the relationship itself, but also just in terms of who they feel themselves to be. And then another aspect of that is that we see Mars in the first house in Cancer. Mars does not like being in Cancer. It's exalted in Capricorn because Capricorn is very steady, very ambitious, very authoritative, and Mars likes that. Mars is a warrior. Mars likes to follow instructions, be really clear, take action on things that matter. Mars in Cancer is more about emotions. It's acting out of emotions, especially Cancer ascendant can be like that anyway, but particularly with Mars in the first house. Mars in the first can be somebody also who's quite dynamic and a lot of fun and really outgoing, and she shows that as well. Certainly ambition is also part of that quality. We see that in a number of different ways in the chart, but nonetheless, Mars in the first can make a person very abrasive. So there's another aspect. So not only are we having some challenges to the ascendant, which is the self, a feeling that unconsciously says, I don't belong here, that makes other people sort of put their hackles up. But then the Pluto squaring that and making the person feel like they got to kind of wrestle things to the ground before they get wrestled to the ground first, that adds to that quality, and that makes another area of abrasion. And then Mars in the first house, this makes a person quite argumentative, really combative. With Mars in the first house, this is a person who will never relent. They will never let go of a battle. And we see this already in her youth. That was kind of her modus operandi. So she's got Mars in a very, very tight square with the midheaven. And of course, whatever's on the opposite of the midheaven, that's home, the IC, the nadir of the chart. Imam Chala is the the home, the house, the family, the roots of the chart. And we see that in square, in a really, really tight square with Mars. And this is also the ruler. Mars is the ruler of the midheaven. So it's an even more impactful Mars. So this woman has drive. She has chutzpah. This is, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know if you already are following this whole drama. But even still, a person with Mars in the first house, even if it's a Mars that doesn't act in good dignity, is going to be pushy and assertive and potentially even aggressive. Now, that Mars has a number of different things about it that can make it feel unsafe for people around this person. One of them is that a Mars in Cancer tends to be passive-aggressive. And again, it's squaring the midheaven, which is authority, and the house, the home, the happiness, the psychological sense of security, the emotional sense of security. And so this is a very defensive Mars. This Mars also rules the fifth house, which is where we find Uranus. And Uranus is in a very strong trine with the ascendant. And this leads to a person being a bit fickle, unstable, unreliable, changeable. It can be that the person sort of appears and then disappears quite quickly in people's lives. And so it's difficult for friendships. And then that same Uranus is opposing Chiron in the house of friendships and groups. And the question that Chiron is asking there is, am I welcome? Do I belong? Do I have my place here? And with that Uranus, that's the answer is going to be very hit and miss, very yes and no, very hot and cold. And so there's a lot already that is so unstable or unreliable or unpredictable. It's another word for Uranus trining the ascendant, that this person can be felt like somebody you want to just keep at arm's length until you get to know them. And so, that's that because that's the ascendant, that's the first impression that one gets. If people are in tune to that, then they're going to be feeling this already. So it's noteworthy that Princess Diana had her natal sun at 9 degrees and 40 minutes of Cancer. So this would have been conjunct. They wouldn't have gotten along very well, I think, for a number of reasons. And so what's interesting is that Harry had mentioned in an earlier clip, he felt very much when he met Meghan that he could feel his mother in her. And it certainly would be this Cancer energy, the Cancer on the ascendant. And it's very interesting to note that Diana also had very prominent nodes in the chart that, in her case, were conjunct not only Uranus on one side, but Mars on the other, and also Pluto's. So let's come back to this fourth house, which is very much connected to that Cancer ascendant, and where the moon is found, so the chart ruler, the moon in the fourth house. This is already indicating quite a lot of instability emotionally and in terms of where one lives. We see with the moon in the fourth that a person finds it difficult to settle, difficult to feel settled emotionally and in one's life, and most particularly when Saturn is right there. So Saturn so close to that will have this feeling of insecurity or unsettledness or feeling of isolation, a lack of love in life. Now, Jupiter comes along to the rescue. Jupiter moon is very, very nice, but Saturn is right in the middle of that. And so although Jupiter is attenuating some of this and allowing her to experience good fortune and great success, this is going to always provoke a certain challenge, because that conjunction of the moon, Saturn, and Jupiter is also squaring the Mars that's in her first house. And that's really difficult. This is what I was alluding to earlier about the potential to be cruel, or to be very controlling, or to be very harsh with people. There's been accusations of bullying, and this would be one way of seeing that, particularly as we see other areas of the chart where working with people as, whether it be colleagues or employees, is not easy. With Neptune in the sixth, that can be a bit of a struggle. And especially because that Neptune is in conjunct the ascendant, and so she's not very clear about who she is. It's motives that are not clear. That's great if you're an actor. And by the way, Uranus in the fifth house is also fantastic for acting. So many of these things that are in a real life person creating a great source of instability are actually really good for acting as a career. It's a skill that she has kind of naturally. She doesn't really have to work too hard at that to put on a show, to display herself in a particular way. And that's what particularly makes people annoyed when it comes to a real relationship. Now, when we come back to this fourth house, we also see that Pluto is there. Pluto in Libra, in that whole generation of Pluto in Libra, which is basically the 1970s and just into the early 80s, that's a really hard aspect for, regardless of house, for relationships. That was that whole generation that completely altered the quality of relationships, and it was a period of time where divorce became much more frequent and much more acceptable, where people were experimenting much more openly with how to be in a different kind of relationship. This is not easy right off the bat in relationship. And then when we see that Pluto is also squaring that relationship axis, we see that this is indeed somebody who has difficulties in relationship kind of right off the bat. And then we see Pluto in the fourth house anyway is always going to be troubling. On top of the issues around the moon and Saturn and Jupiter, we're going to see that Pluto is going to create a lot of disruption in the home and family. What happens with the Pluto, as well as with the Saturn, is that part of the thing that blocks us in life, the success that we want, is coming from that experience, that early foundational experience, especially fourth house, foundational psychology, emotional nature, sense of happiness, sense of security. That is going to cause some difficulties in life. And we're seeing that, in spades. Her challenges in relationship, her challenges in the notion of what is home and family and how to handle important relationships are all being put on display. That's partly because her Pluto has been squared over the last few years. I'll show that when we look at the transits. But this is already there natally, so it's a double whammy for her. So what happens with Pluto in the fourth is this kind of repeated pattern of childhood drama and trauma all the way into, well into adulthood, until you figure that out, until you work on that and try and sort that out. And in her case, I think that's going to be a big job. It's a really, really big job anyway, but it's even bigger when you keep putting yourself out in the public eye and expecting adoration and getting instead the same feedback that you unconsciously were looking for as a child, which is exclusion and not belonging. So there's also an issue around victim and perpetrator with Pluto in the fourth house, around family issues of aggression. And this is something, again, that makes her stand out as somebody who both carves out that identity of victim, and that we also see even more strongly because Pluto is not just squaring the ascendant descendant, but Pluto is also in conjunct Chiron, which emphasizes that energy very strongly, and it's also sextiling the Neptune that's in her sixth house. And so we're seeing a lot of that energy of victim perpetrator there in the chart. It's a difficult thing to manage, especially you need to really work through these things in a very skillful way, very profound way, because it's deep. Wherever Pluto is, it's deep, latent fear. It's latent, unconscious shadow stuff. And that requires a certain skill to work on that. If I were working with a client who had this kind of thing, at this point, I would absolutely recommend that they do something like family constellations work, or real helpful therapeutic work along the lines of proactively trying to understand the first of all impersonal situation that they find themselves in this family lineage, but also trying to understand the family dynamics and how that affected the childhood and the formational years, and how that's showing up as a mirror, and to own one's sense of happiness and stability. And to take responsibility. This is a big word in her chart because that's something that doesn't really show up naturally. Taking responsibility for one's own emotional nature. I say that for all the reasons I've just put out there, which show that there is very little personal responsibility around emotions. So we have Mars in the first house in Cancer throwing tantrums or being passive aggressive, and then we have Neptune, which is, in a difficult aspect and in conjunct to the ascendant, showing that there's not a real awareness around how one stands out. And then we have the Uranus, which is also trining the ascendant, which is flaky and unreliable and not taking responsibility. And I come back again to say that this is not the first time around. This is part of the family pattern. So there's a multi-generational aspect of this that is coming through her chart. And so, again, we want to find that compassion for this individual who just lands in this aquarium of this stuff and then has to also, navigate her own way around this life. And so of course, another really important aspect of her chart is the sun. That's always going to be important regardless of the situation. So I always want to really start to understand the ascendant. I go from the ascendant to the chart ruler, then I go to the moon, then I go to the sun. Not always in the same order, but it's whatever really dominates the chart. I'm really starting to work with that. And then the rest comes later on. It kind of fills in the gaps, as it were. So when we come to the sun, we see a very strong sun in Leo. Second house sun is very happy. The sun is very happy in the second house because it's all about things that are grounded and material. And the sun can be very happy with that kind of stability. It's a fixed sign, Leo, the fixed sign. And of course, Leo is the ruler. And of course, the sun is the ruler of Leo, and so the sun is right at home there. There is also Mercury in Leo. Mercury in Leo emphasizes that Leo quality in terms of also how one thinks about oneself and how one communicates as well. Second house is all about speech. And so when we see the sun there, we see already we've got somebody who wants to be noticed. They want to be seen. We see that sun is also semi-sextiling Mars. That's a really ambitious person, very, very driven, very hot temper as well. Somebody who's got a really short fuse. And also with the sun in a sextile to the IC, we see again, and then a trine to the MC exact. We see a lot of ambition and drive, a person who is quite egotistically involved in their career. They want to be seen in the career. So this is very, very powerful. We see these 11 degrees showing up here in a way that's extremely powerful. So the midheaven, which is squared by Mars, is that ambitious drive, that desire to control and to dominate. We see the sextile between Mars and Venus ruling all of this fourth house. I didn't mention that yet. Very passionate, very enthusiastic, very inspiring. And so that's also, that's very favorable. Of course, it's very, very passionate and very driven, but this person is never going to sit still. Like, there's just no way that this person will stop trying, and that can be very much working against them as much as working in their favor, because they don't know when to quit. And then that's when we come back to this Leo, particularly with the Mercury in Leo. There's very little self-awareness around how one communicates, how one expresses themselves, so that there is this tendency to be speaking without regard to whether the people around you actually want to hear what you're saying. And we see that quite a lot in her. I've again, to my detriment, I've spent a lot of time looking at these clips and different aspects of what's going on in her life in the last few years. And this is something that stands out, this kind of tendency to be saying stuff without any consideration for how that lands with other people, or whether other people might even be interested. So, so that's problematic on its own, but here's the big problem. And the big problem is Rahu, the North Node. Now, Western astrology doesn't give the importance to Rahu that I think it deserves. Indian astrology understands it much, much better. It is a malefic. Both the nodes, the south and the north node, north node is Rahu, south node is Ketu, they are not friendly. They're not helpful. They are obsessive. They have us driven and focused to the point of not, to the point of losing perspective. Rahu is there with Mercury, and it's also conjunct the ascendant. So I do out of sign conjunctions when something is so significant. Not always. If it's a smaller, less meaningful planet or situation, I don't give it so much importance. But this is really important on the ascendant. The other thing to know is that she was born 5 days after a solar eclipse. There was one on the 31st of July. Always check, if you're an astrologer, always check for eclipses before and around the time a person is born, because you want to understand how that particular eclipse point will affect them. So that in that case, it was at 7 degrees. So it was not exact by any means, but it was close enough to that Mercury. It was certainly significant in her life. Now, before that, almost 3 weeks before, about 20 days before, there was also a lunar eclipse, and that happened at 24 degrees of Capricorn. So that lunar eclipse creates a very sensitive point on the descendant that she's going to carry for the rest of her life. I suspect that before she was born, there was some big issue going on between the parents already, around that tender time just before birth. And this point has been passed over by Pluto since the very beginning of 2020, which it turns out is when most of this drama has happened. Now again, it's not only passing over this descendant and therefore in opposition to the ascendant, but that also has been squaring her natal Pluto. So for the last 3 years, effectively, she's had a Pluto square, which is moving on, and instead, she's soon going to have Pluto on the south node. That's a very significant and very challenging transit. Now, when we have the north node on Mercury, we often find a person who will exaggerate. Mercury in Leo will embellish to look good. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a liar. But when we have Mercury with the north node, that's somebody who can actually be a liar. It's somebody who can be confused about what they're saying or not honest about what they're saying. So this Rahu Mercury provokes quite a lot of challenges, especially because it's describing a similar thing of this Mars in Cancer, which is in a challenging semi-sextile to the Sun. Let me just read to you what is written about Rahu in regards to what it represents and how that might affect planets. Now, keep in mind that this is also affecting Harry's moon. So Rahu, who is the head of the dragon, is shadow. It is smoke-colored, ugly and awkward, has a smoky complexion. It speaks to create divisions. It's argumentative, harsh, fake, deceptive, selfish, cunning, manipulative. It provokes illusion and confusion. So this is the Indian way of looking at Rahu. Rahu is also where we get obsessed with something. In Meghan's case, it's obsession around recognition. It's obsession around being seen, being special, shining. Now, when somebody has mastered that and understood the real meaning of that, they can really stand out as leaders. And particularly because that North Node, South Node axis in Leo and Aquarius is all about leadership. It's a very powerful signature for leaders. But Rahu will consume you. It just creates obsessions, and it can be blind ambition. It distorts your perspective. And when we see Mercury there, we have to wonder, does the person see clearly through their speech, through what they're saying, through how they're thinking, how they're communicating? And there again is another one of the messages around dishonesty. So one of them comes just from the fact that we've got this Leo and Cancer combination, the Leo Sun Cancer rising, shows there's some complications in the family with a number of the things that I alluded to earlier. But also, here we have Rahu kind of reinforcing that. Then we look at the south node. Now, the south node in the 8th house, that's hard. So this axis between the 8th and the 2nd houses is really challenging. It's something that a person has to deal with in a very delicate way. Now, again, if somebody is consulting with me and they have planets on this axis, so it's not just if the axis is there, that's already a little bit challenging, but if there are planets on this axis, we really want to understand how this person is experiencing this. And with the south node in the 8th house, that's the house of fear, manipulation, power struggles, control, disgrace and scandal, money from other people, shared resources, gains from marriage. Now, again, this is striking all of those most challenging aspects of the 8th house. It is challenging. The 8th house is one of the Dusthana houses. It's one of the challenging houses of astrology. And so this is not going to be easy. Having a south node there means that you're coming already with difficulty as baggage. You're going towards something very, very different. And what you're going to be doing is relying on what you understood before about how life operated until you figure out the new way of operating. So here, for example, we have the south node trining the moon. And that's a sign that the person is stuck in negative patterns, negative emotional patterns from childhood, or especially in relationships, because we're talking about a Libra moon. And then, of course, the south node is also trining Saturn, because the Saturn is right next to the moon. And that's inherited emotional problems. So it's, again, not just the first time. And also avoidance of responsibility, which again is an inherited pattern. We also have Ketu, the south node, trining Jupiter. And so that trine to Jupiter is going to show an impractical nature, impracticality around goals, and being ungrounded in terms of one's ambitions and goals. And of course, the same thing is on the other side, being sextile to that north node, saying all the same things. Ketu is an aspect of the things that are we're kind of stuck on, that we find it difficult to let go of, but we must. We're supposed to be letting go of them. And Rahu is everything that we're trying to learn. It's what we're trying to understand. We haven't figured it out yet, but it becomes also a source of obsession. And as we saw, Rahu is about deception. It's not what you see. Rahu is the thing that literally blocks out the light. It blocks the luminaries. So it's showing us an aspect that we're not seeing clearly. And often those figures are polarizing. They're people who are in the world, we can see them stand out in a way that is quite polarizing. At the very least, even if the person keeps a very private life, they have a very eventful and challenging life when there are planets on the nodes. And in the case of somebody who's really grasping at being seen, for example, all of this energy in Leo, trying to be seen, trying to show up in this world as somebody special, and then having that also emphasized by the midheaven being squared by its ruler, Mars, in the first house. This individual is very ambitious, very, very strongly ambitious. And Rahu is going to drag the person kicking and screaming through the mud till they finally understand that actually the real lesson of Leo is not to be famous. It is not to be seen. It is to be humble. This is the big lesson of the Leo-Aquarius axis, humility. Indeed, Harry has the same lesson to learn in his life for slightly different reasons. It's positioned differently in his chart, but the lesson is the same. They both need to learn humility. So we've seen that Rahu and Mercury together can make a person manipulative and deceptive, but also I want to come back to that Pluto, which is squaring the ascendant-descendant axis, which is the relationship axis. This is somebody who ends up in abusive relationship situations, psychologically abusive and potentially physically abusive with Mars in the first house. But the thing is that they, of course, don't start that way. There's a genuine attraction, there's a genuine physical spark, there's something there, but there's a toxicity that is there in the relationships. This is, again, something that this person is here to work through. And in that regard, I would, if this were my client, I would counsel that person to go to a specialist, go to a relationship therapist, and work through these really difficult challenges in relationship. So once they overcome this pride, which is that the shadow side of Leo, and especially when Rahu is there, then the real capacity to lead and show the way with heart, Leo's all about heart and joy and an expansive warmth, is going to be sincere. So the other aspect of Rahu, when it's conjunct a planet, is that it ends up showing a certain fakery about that planet. So it's this deception. So it's faking that expression, fake it till you make it. So this is really one of the reasons people don't respond to her, aside from the Mars on the ascendant and all that I've said so far, is that she comes across as fake. And that's in her speech and also in herself, because the ascendant is only 7 degrees off that. And then, of course, the sun is about 10 degrees off that. So it's a big orb, but in a natal chart, I definitely would look at such a big orb. The ascendant is much more pressing in this regard. So there's a feeling that this person is not being themselves. And I want to point out that that's not necessarily nefarious. It's not because the person is trying to be awful or trying to be better than other people. They genuinely are trying to figure out how to show up in this world. And with all of this energy, particularly emphasized again with Chiron there in the 11th house, that's a job. That's quite a job. It's really hard to figure that out. How do I show up in the world? What do people want from me? South Node in the 8th house also shows that we've been living through another person's idea of what is important, living through other people's values. And with the North Node in the 2nd house, it's about living through your own values, first and foremost, figuring out what those values are, and then living through them. This is really quite important. So it's a big, big lesson for her. So she definitely has some hallmarks of narcissism in the chart, but more so that there is such a strong desire to be seen that she's pretty ruthless about the whole thing. She's really ready to lie or elbow her way to what it is that she wants. Now again, she's got a potential for great success. Jupiter and Saturn and the moon are a really great indicator of success opposite the midheaven. Fantastic. However, she's her own worst enemy. That's what's really showing up there. That's another way of, when we see Uranus in the 5th house, that's another sign that says you are your own worst enemy. Rahu on these planets, that's where we can say, well, where are you, your own worst enemy? And then Chiron again, that's another self-sabotage aspect. One thing I haven't pointed out is Eris. Now, I put Eris in this chart just to show up where it stands out in relationship to other things. So in her case, the orbs are very broad. Eris is an asteroid. It's not very often used, but Eris really stands out because Eris is like the female component of Pluto. And Eris is often showing up where we want to disturb something, disturbing and changing things, with the idea of pointing out hypocrisy, the idea of stirring the pot in a way that shows up hypocrisy. Now here she's doing that on the midheaven, calling out what's going wrong, and then squaring Mars. This is really combative. It's really aggressive. So there's ways of showing Eris up in the chart. By the way, Eris is in Aries for everyone because it moves so slowly. Eris is only at something like 24 degrees now. So over the course of 42 years, it's only moved less than 10 degrees. So it is a very slow-moving planet. Most people alive have Eris in Aries, and this is something we're contending with. That's why I don't always point out to Eris in the chart, because it's such a background influence. But in her case, very interesting, because Eris is close to the midheaven, and it's got this Mars, which is ruling it, square. And so again, another indication that there is some real challenge, and that's another way that she shows up in the world. This is how people feel her. So definitely something to bear in mind. And finally, just again to come back to the childhood again before I forget, because we want to understand why why the pain? What is making this person behave in this particular way? And in this person's case, it's this childhood separation from the father. So we see that Saturn affecting the moon, Saturn affecting Jupiter, is cutting off the person from their father. It's a distant relationship from the father. The father is either emotionally absent or physically absent. But the mother also doesn't really show up emotionally. There's a lot of there's a distance and some challenge with both parents. And this complicates relationships of all kinds. So authority relationships, parents and juniors, and issues around bullying. So these are certainly there. Again, both sides of the coin are there in the chart. With Mars in Cancer and Mars in the first house, particularly with all of these aspects, it's a very divisive and assertive or aggressive, bold person that we're seeing here, unrelenting and vengeful. So she's bringing out a lot of the worst qualities of the chart in what she wants to show the world, because she doesn't know really how to be herself. In many ways, it's like acting out. She's acting out all of the things that she was trying to get away from in her childhood. It has to be said, if she didn't have this very strong desire for fame and this desire to be seen, which once again runs in the family, I think she would have had a much more calm life. And the fact that she has to go through such a difficult process of understanding herself in a public way, again, through her own doing, and especially in the age of social media, which I think is adding to the toxicity of this kind of a chart, because this kind of a chart is going to go in the direction of showing off, in the direction of social media, and in the direction of the falsehood, like we see with the North Node on Mercury, in the direction of the falsehoods that social media tends to provoke. So it's not an easy road. With regards to her children, Mars also rules the house of children, which in and of itself is not necessarily problematic, gives a lot of potential challenges around children. Often with a Mars-ruled house of children, there can be issues around childbirth, issues that are complications, losses, or some kind of operation, or some kind of challenge around childbirth. And also because Uranus is there in the fifth house, it's a parent who tends to be a little bit on again, off again around their children, or they'll have a very unique and different relationship around children, kind of an interest in them, but not really feeling too bonded with the children, or not really feeling super maternal, let's say. And one of the ways that we can see that kind of panning out is because the mothering is seen in the moon, and when we see that in Libra, often that is more where the person is looking to their children as a reflection of their own self, as opposed to something that they can emotionally connect with. However much she wants to, the emotional bonding is prevented by this Saturn there. And so that connection is difficult, not just with their children, but with everybody. The emotions are blocked, the emotions are cut off, and she finds it very, very difficult to really get close. So there's a lot of sort of performative snuggling and showing up in relationship, but it's challenging. The last thing I will say, just to wrap up on the natal chart, is that her Venus is in Virgo, which is another way of saying that her high expectations around relationships will always lead to some kind of disappointment until she figures out that her own happiness doesn't come from the way other people are behaving. And this is a very important lesson for Venus in Virgo. It's a person who can be extremely picky, very critical, keeping in mind that Harry's Sun and Mercury are in Virgo. That it gives another indication of how henpecked he might be. I'll be speaking about that in a separate video. But again, just to say that this third house Venus is ruled by Mercury, which is nice. You can have friends and can be very social and so on, but tends to see what's wrong before seeing what's right in other people. And so that judgmentalism, this kind of ideal of perfection in relationship, is always going to be an obstacle to really fully being in relationship. So, seeking the passion and romance that we get in that sextile to Mars, but the both the Venus and the Mars are not in great shape, and so not really getting what they would hope. And so lots of unrealistic expectations and disappointment in relationship. The Mars is squaring the natal Jupiter as well, and that Mars square Jupiter makes a person impulsive and adds to a sense of carelessness or impatience or poor judgment. So again, it's another indication of being your own worst enemy, something that she has in a number of different aspects in the chart. So I'll leave it at that, and then we'll have a look at the transits and how that's going to be affecting her.